Hello everybody, my name is Mark Pearson. In 1948, President Truman had a 35% approval rating. The polls all indicated that there was no way he was going to win, and yet he did. What's similar between President Truman in 1948 and President Trump in 2020? Polls, campaign, and the message. Thank you for watching the Honor and Knowledge channel. In 1948, President Truman had a lot of challenges against his election as president. Election, not re-election, because he had been the vice president when President Roosevelt had passed away in his fourth term. Therefore, President Truman was up for his first actual election campaign. In the spring of 1948, he had a 35% approval rating. All the polls at the time were totally against President Truman winning the election. So how did he do it? We're going to talk about that, and it's very similar to what is happening with President Trump. First of all, a little bonus tidbit to show the similarities between the two of them. President Trump is very proud of having started the Space Force branch of the military. Well, guess what? The United States Air Force became its own branch of the military under President Truman before he won his election. First, let's talk about presidential election polls. In 2020, I won't bore you about the biases and everything we know what's wrong with the 2020 polls. They're very similar to the 2016 polls. Let's talk about the 1948 polls. With a 35% approval rating, which, by the way, is a poll, President Truman was not viewed as somebody that could win election. Why were the polls wrong? Very simple. They used telephone calls to get poll results. And that's exactly why the polls were wrong. Guess who didn't own telephones in 1948? The people that supported President Truman, the Midwest people, farmers. So the polls were all wrong. But the polls were so far ahead for his opponent that in mid-October they stopped doing more polls. The Chicago Daily Tribune was a newspaper that did not like President Truman. They were so certain that President Truman was going to lose the election that they went ahead and printed their newspaper saying that he had lost it. Of course, that led to the iconic photograph of President Truman holding up the newspaper showing the headline that he had lost the election. So the first thing similar between 1948 and 2020 is the polls all had it wrong in 1948. And then there was the campaigning that President Truman did. It's actually famous in history. It's called his whistle stop tour. He got on a train and went around a lot of places. There were 3 phases of President Truman's 1948 whistle stop tour. He did a 15-day tour going from the East Coast to the West Coast and then back to the East Coast. Second, he did a 6-day tour of the Midwest. Third, he did a 10-day tour of the Northeast. Then he went back home to Missouri. He spoke from the train. See any similarity between that and what President Trump is doing by doing his rallies around the country? These were spontaneous crowds that came out for President Truman's whistle-stop tours. Sound familiar? President Trump gets a lot of spontaneous support. So the campaign style of President Truman at the last few weeks before the election day is very similar to what President Trump is doing. Then there was the message that he gave and how he gave that message. Here are some quotes from historians writing about President Truman's message to the people in 1948. He spoke personally and passionately, sometimes even setting aside his notes to talk to Americans of everything that is in my heart and soul. His combative appearances captured the popular imagination and drew huge crowds. If you watch President Trump's speeches, listen to his words. Sounds very much like he could be described by those quotes about President Truman. Speaks from his heart, interacts with the people, is combative, and he definitely has a personal appeal to the nation. We won't even contrast how he is campaigning with that of former Vice President Biden. No reason to go there. On the thumbnail description for this video, I added respect for Israel. The reason why I'm putting this in the video is because it shows some of the character of President Truman, similar to the character of President Trump. It was not an easy decision for President Truman's administration to determine whether or not to recognize Israel as a new country when it was formed in 1948. That was because the United States needed oil, and the United States was concerned about going to war with either the Soviet Union or Communist China, or both, and therefore desperately would have needed the oil in Saudi Arabia. Looking back on President Truman, he had always been supportive of Israel being formed as a homeland for the people who had escaped the Holocaust. His Secretary of Defense and his Secretary of State, both famous people in history, Forrestal and Marshall, were against the recognition of the State of Israel because what it would do with Saudi Arabia's relations with the United States. However, 11 minutes after the State of Israel was born, President Truman recognized it. He did that because he was interested in justice. President Trump moved the United States Embassy to Jerusalem, the way that he had promised, and not only he had promised, but many presidents before him had promised and never delivered. I just thought that showed a similarity between President Truman's and President Trump's character, what's inside the person. So in conclusion, the polls were against President Truman, as they are against President Trump. Their approval ratings were low, but that's a poll too. Their campaign styles and how they went around and visited the American people in the last few weeks of the election campaign, very similar. And how they spoke to the American people and their message from their hearts, very similar. President Truman won his election in 1948. In a few days, we'll see how President Trump does. Thank you for watching the Honor and Knowledge channel.